Congresswoman Kay Granger. Congressman Michael Burgess. And Bill Thornton, the President and CEO of the Fort Worth Chamber. I know we also have a number of elected officials with us here today. If you are an elected official, please stand or wave and let us recognize you. Again, thank you to all of our sponsors and welcome to our very special guests. And now on to the reason you are all here today. In 2012, Ted Cruz was elected the 34th senator from the great state of Texas. The election was described by the Washington Post as, and I quote, "the biggest upset of 2012, a true grassroots victory against very long odds," unquote. Before being elected senator, Senator Cruz received national acclaim as the Solicitor General for the state of Texas, the state's chief lawyer before the United States Supreme Court. During his service as Solicitor General, Texas achieved an unprecedented series of landmark national victories. He successfully defended the U.S. sovereignty from the World Court and the United Nations. He defended our Second Amendment right to bear arms. He preserved the Texas Ten Commandments monument. And he fought and won the case preserving the words, "under God," in our Pledge of Allegiance. Senator Cruz serves on 5 Senate committees: the Commerce Committee, the Armed Services Committee, the Judiciary Committee, the Special Committee on Aging, and the Rules Committee. Senator, you're very busy. Senator Cruz graduated from Princeton University with honors, and he graduated from Harvard Law School with high honors. He also served as a law clerk to Chief Justice William Rehnquist of the United States Supreme Court, the first Hispanic to do so. A more extensive bio is in your program, and I encourage you to read that at your leisure. But now, without further ado, please join me in a warm Fort Worth welcome for Senator Ted Cruz.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that very kind introduction. Thank you for the warm welcome. Kay Granger and Michael Burgess and I, we spent all this past week back in Washington, D.C. So it is great to be back in America. You know, it's been cold lately. It's been really cold. 2 weeks ago, I am told that President Obama said he'll admit that Obamacare isn't working when hell freezes over. The next week, Washington, D.C. was covered nice. You know, I can tell you, I will make a commitment to you. I will do my very, very best to try to speak for under 21 hours. But you'll know that I'm nearing the end if and when I bring out and start to read The Cat in the Hat. You know, I gotta say, 21 hours is a long time. It's really a long time. Look, that's almost as long as it takes to sign up on the Obamacare website. It's great to be back and it's great to be home, because this is a time of enormous change. The most consistent thing I hear all across the state when I come home is people who say they're scared. They're scared for where our country's going. They're scared for the challenges we're facing. They're scared that the kids and grandkids are not going to have the same opportunities all of us have been blessed to have. But these aren't typical times in politics. These aren't ordinary challenges. I think we are facing extraordinary fiscal and economic threats. Extraordinary threats. And I want to talk to you about three things today. Number one, liberty is under assault. Liberty is under assault right now. You know, at times it seems this administration is trying to go down the Bill of Rights and violate them one after the other after the other. Whether it's the First Amendment and this administration's consistent disregard for religious liberty, in particular disrespecting the religious liberty of the men and women who serve us in the armed forces, or it's the Second Amendment. You know, Vice President Joe Biden isn't that a nice thing? You don't need a punchline. You just say his name. I promise you. Try it at a cocktail party. Next time you're at a party, just say Vice President Joe Biden and close your mouth. People will crack up laughing. But Vice President Joe Biden suggested, he said, if anyone attacks your house, just go outside with a double-barreled shotgun and fire both barrels in the air. Which is very, very good advice if it so happens you're being attacked by a flock of geese. But this administration has been the most hostile administration in history to our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. You look at the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, you look at our right to privacy. I don't know how many of y'all have your cell phones. I'm going to ask that you leave your cell phones on. I want to make sure President Obama hears everything we had to say. Liberty is under assault. And every bit as troubling as the assault on our Bill of Rights is the pattern of lawlessness we have seen from this administration. A systematic disregard of the law. Look, we saw it early on. The president was newly in office and he issued a moratorium on offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Had no legal authority to do so, as a federal court concluded. And when a federal court said you have no authority to shut down drilling, what did he do? He reimposed the moratorium anyway. In open defiance. You look no further if you want to see a pattern of lawlessness than the implementation of Obamacare. The implementation of Obamacare, over and over again, the president says, it's the law of the land. We should follow the law. Oh, really? Well, then why doesn't the administration follow the law? Text of the statute says the employer mandate applies to all big businesses starting on January 1st, 2014. That's what the law says. The president announced, no it doesn't. He was granting a waiver to big businesses. So the text of the law says it doesn't apply. Big business doesn't get a waiver. The president says, yes, they do. For 1 year. That part of the law we're not going to follow. Text of the law says members of Congress are supposed to be on the Obamacare exchanges with no subsidies, just like millions of Americans. Well, what happened? Harry Reid, the Senate Democrats, met with President Obama. And they said, this thing is terrible. We followed Nancy Pelosi's advice. We passed it to find out what's in it. It's terrible. The president said, don't worry, I got your back. And he issued a unilateral exemption for members of Congress. You know, it used to be that if you want to know what the law is, you go look at the United States Code at the words that are passed in the law. You know, you think most strikingly, the most striking failure that Obamacare has produced, which is roughly 5 million people who've had their health insurance canceled. Now, that was despite the president's repeated promises to this country, if you like your health insurance plan, you can keep it. Period. Well, it turns out that statement was repeatedly, deliberately false. So what happened? You know, if you think back to grade school, to civics, if you have a law that's not working, there's a way in our constitutional system you go fix it. You go to Congress. You know, how many of y'all remember Schoolhouse Rock? You know, I'm just a bill. That's the way our system for a couple of hundred years has worked. If it's not working, you go to Congress and change the law to fix it. Well, instead, what the president did is he held a press conference. He held a press conference, and the reason 5 million people have already lost their health insurance because of Obamacare is Obamacare makes their health insurance illegal. It's the federal government saying, you may like your health insurance, but we determine we don't like your health insurance. So it's prohibited by law. And the president held a press conference in which he instructed insurers, instructed private companies, go and violate the law. I'm telling you, issue insurance policies that the law makes illegal. And as president, I'm going to ignore that part of the law, and I'm telling you right now, go violate the law for 1 year. And then in another year, then you have to follow the law. Unless I change my mind and say you don't. I want to suggest to you that when you have a president who picks and chooses what parts of the law to follow, says we'll follow this law but not that law, we'll follow section 1, 2, and 3 of this law but not 4, and section 5, A and C, but B on alternate Thursdays. You know, the idea of rule of law is foundational to who we are as Americans. It's the principle that we're a nation of laws and not of men, that the president doesn't get to pick and choose whether to follow the law, that every person is bound by the law. And when you've got a president who is picking and choosing which laws to follow, you no longer have a president. That's dangerous. That is dangerous for liberty. And I would suggest something to you also, which is, where are the Democrats on this? You know, there have been Republican presidents that have abused their power, that have overreached, and I'm proud to say when that's happened, Republicans have stood up and called them to account and said, you're overreaching, you're reaching too far, the Constitution matters. Whether you agree or disagree with the president's particular policies, if you believe in liberty, the idea that this president or the next president or the next president can choose which laws to follow and which laws not to follow is incredibly dangerous for the liberty of the citizens. Liberty is under assault. But the second thing I want to talk to you about is opportunities under assault. You know, the last 5 years, we have seen economic stagnation. From 2008 to 2012, our economy grew on average 0.9% a year. There's only one other period since World War II of 4 consecutive years of less than 1% GDP growth. That was 1979 and 1982. That was coming out of the Jimmy Carter administration. It was the same failed policies, out of control spending and taxes and regulation produced the exact same stagnation. Produced people hurting. You know, the president this past week has been talking about income inequality. What he doesn't address is the fact that the economic policies we followed these past 5 years have increased economic inequality. Do you know that right now today, the top 1% in this country earn a higher share of our national income than any time since 1928? Truth of the matter is, when you have big government policies, the rich do fine. The people who get hurt, the people who get hammered, are the people who are struggling. They're young people, they're Hispanics, they're African Americans, they're single moms, they're people who are working to climb the economic ladder to achieve the American dream. You know, I try to think about policies and how they impact people from the perspective of my dad. Many of y'all have gotten to know my father. 56 years ago, he fled Cuba after being imprisoned and tortured and came to Texas as a teenager. Washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. And I try to think about, you know, if my dad was still washing dishes today, how would the policies that Washington has put in place have impacted him? If he was washing dishes today, the odds are very good he would have lost his job because of the massive taxes and regulations that have come in the last 5 years, because of the crushing impacts of Obamacare. If he hadn't lost his job, the odds are overwhelming that he would have been forced to work part-time, 28, 29 hours a week, because the threshold for Obamacare is 30 hours a week. All over the country. Look, if you're a single mom trying to feed your kids, you can't feed your kids on 29 hours a week. And that's what Obamacare is doing to people all over the country. If you're like my dad was, a teenage immigrant trying to pay your way through school, you can't pay your way through school on 29 hours a week. Those are the people who are being hurt by what's happening. I can tell you in the slightly over a year that I've served in office, my number one priority every single day has been restoring jobs and economic growth. And the reason's simple. Because that's the top priority of Texas. I try to come back to Texas every week, travel across the state, and spend a lot of time just listening. Listening to you. Listening to the 26 million Texans, to the men and women for whom I work. Doesn't matter where in the state you are. If you travel the state and ask Texans, what's your top priority? The answer is the same in East Texas, in West Texas, up in the Panhandle, or down in the Valley. Texans consistently say their top priority is restoring jobs and economic growth. And the sad truth of it is, in the last year, in the U.S. Senate, we've spent virtually zero time even talking about jobs and economic growth. We spent 6 weeks talking about the president's efforts to undermine the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens, and virtually no time talking about fundamental tax reform. Dramatically simplifying the tax code to reduce the burdens on small businesses and entrepreneurs and those who are struggling. We spent virtually no time talking about regulatory reform. Stopping the job-killing burdens Obamacare is putting on small business, stopping the crushing burden Dodd-Frank is putting on financial institutions, stopping the enormous environmental burdens, opening up our energy resources. You know, this is a room of a lot of people who understand the energy industry. And one of the great things that we have seen in recent years is we have seen energy transform in this country. Through technological advances, horizontal drilling and fracking, we're opening reserves that 5 years ago would have been unimaginable. And if we simply got the federal government out of the way, if we stopped the federal regulatory threats to interfere with fracking, if we opened up federal lands to exploration, if we opened up our resources and let entrepreneurs develop the God-given resources we have in this country, we could see an American energy renaissance. Millions of high-paying jobs all across this country, bringing back jobs and economic growth, and bringing back growth. The biggest impact of that is opportunity. The biggest impact of that is on people who are struggling. Because look, the massive taxes and regulations, the titans of business do fine. The people who get hurt are those who are struggling. And we need to bring back opportunity. And that leads to the third and final point I want to make. Only the American people can turn this around. You know, if you remember nothing I said today, and you were probably drinking more than iced tea. If you remember just one thing I say today, I hope it is this, that I am profoundly optimistic that we are going to pull this country back from these fiscal and economic threats. But I'll tell you right now, the answers are not going to come from Washington. Unfortunately, Washington, you've got career politicians in both parties, a whole lot of whom have stopped listening to the American people. You know, people wonder why Congress is at 10, 12, 14% approval rate. Well, when the top priority of the American people is jobs and economic growth, and the U.S. Senate is too busy even to talk about jobs and economic growth, I'm surprised the approval rate is that high. But the answer, I'm convinced, is going to come from the American people. And if you look at the past year, there was a remarkable transformation in politics, and it was not heavily commented on in the media. But the most important transformation I think we saw the last year in politics was the rise of the grassroots. The rise of the grassroots and the demonstration to the American people that we can change what's happening in Washington and make a difference. You know, I saw it initially. Early last year, one of the first big fights that I participated in is I was proud to stand side by side with my friend Senator Rand Paul in his epic filibuster on drones. And when he stood up there talking, a lot of our Senate colleagues didn't know what he was talking about. And what happened is the American people started getting engaged, started speaking out, started saying, we want to protect our liberties. You know, as the night went on, you saw some senators, some older senators who've been there a long time, who came back. They'd been at home, they'd been in bed, they came back to stand with Rand. You'd see him walking on the Senate floor going, you know, my staff told me the Tweety thing is happening. And as a result of millions of Americans speaking up, the next day the president was forced to do what he refused to do for 3 consecutive weeks, which is admit in writing that the Constitution restricts his authority to target U.S. citizens. That was remarkable, and that came from the people. A couple months later, the next big fight was the fight over guns. And following the horrific shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, all of Washington was convinced the president's gun control agenda was unstoppable. And then something amazing happened. All across the country, people began speaking up, began talking to their elected officials, began lighting up the phone saying, look, violent criminals, come down on them like a ton of bricks, but protect the constitutional rights of law-abiding Americans. And as a result of millions of Americans standing up and holding our elected officials accountable, when those proposals came to a vote on the floor of the Senate, every single proposal that would have undermined the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms was voted down on the floor of the Senate. That was remarkable. It was a remarkable shift. We saw a few months later what happened with regard to Syria. If you'll recall, the president announced that he intended to launch a unilateral military attack against Syria. And bipartisan leaders in both parties announced very quickly they supported the president's decision to launch a unilateral military attack. And what happened next was incredible. All across the country, the American people rose up. And they said, we don't want to send our sons and daughters to get in the middle of a sectarian civil war between Sunni and Shiites, where we don't have any clear national security interest in the outcome of that dispute. I can tell you in my office, the calls on Syria from Texas were literally 99.95 to 1. It was overwhelming. It was deafening. You'd come home to Texas, have a crowd group, you couldn't find a single person who thought we should send our kids and get in the middle of that civil war. And suddenly something that was unstoppable stopped. That's the power of the grassroots, and that is transforming. And then the biggest demonstration of all has been the fight over Obamacare. Now, if you look at what happened last year, you saw over 2 million people all over the country rise up and say, we need to defund Obamacare. We need to stop Obamacare. This thing isn't working. Millions of people are hurt. Now, an awful lot of folks on the left, an awful lot of folks in the media, although I repeat myself, they said the fight to defund Obamacare didn't work. Really? You know, I'm a big believer that the proof is in the pudding. As a result of over 2 million Americans standing up and saying, stop this train wreck, this disaster of a law, number one, we saw the House of Representatives, House Republicans stood strong, demonstrated a profile of courage, said we're going to stand in the way and stop this disaster of a law. But number two, as a result of that, it elevated the debate nationally. It elevated the debate nationally about the harms that Obamacare is causing. Right now, the president finds himself at the lowest approval rating he's ever been. Obamacare is at its lowest approval rating it's ever been. Obamacare is plummeting in approval among young people. It's plummeting in approval among Hispanics. It's plummeting in approval among independents. It's plummeting in approval among Democrats. And the reason is simple. Listen, 4 years ago, when Obamacare was being debated in Congress, reasonable minds perhaps could have differed. Reasonable minds perhaps could have believed maybe this thing would work. Looking at the disaster that has happened, just looking at the facts, you can't say that. When you've got over 5 million people who've lost their health insurance, had their health insurance canceled because of Obamacare. And every time I travel back to Texas, I have people, men and women, come up to me, put their arms on my shoulders, and they say, listen, I just had my health insurance canceled. You know, moms who have kids that have diabetes, and they're scared. They say, what am I supposed to do? How do I take care of my family? You look at premiums that are skyrocketing. A 27-year-old man in Texas, the individual market is seeing his premium increase by roughly 70%. Headline of the New York Times, middle class struggles under health care. Now, that's not me talking. That's that famed right-wing rag, the New York Times. Talking about people, talking about a couple in New Hampshire that was suddenly getting premiums that had skyrocketed that they couldn't afford. You want to know just how far